And we are live. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our April speaker series, Arm Yourself Against Disinformation. We will be talking today about the COVID-19 vaccine. My name is Meghna Mahadevan. My pronouns are she, they, and I'm a partner at New Currents Collective. We are an innovation home for movement, leadership, and community. And we're so excited to bring this programming to you today in collaboration with the Disinfo Defense League. The Disinfo Defense League, who many of you all may be a part of, may be aware of, and if you're not, we hope to make you aware of us, is a network of organizations working together to fight against racialized disinformation. So we're really excited to have you here, and I'm sure many of you all are pretty aware or made aware of what the issue of disinformation is. But we are specifically focused on racialized disinformation, which is really thinking through the strategic use of how information can be taken to mislead and create wedges within and around communities of color. And so today we are talking about COVID-19 vaccine disinformation. And we've brought together an amazing panel of guests, which I'm super excited to introduce in a moment. But before we go there, I do want to talk to you all a little bit about why we decided to have this conversation. So many of y'all may be aware of the different conversations happening around COVID disinformation, the conspiracies happening, the different ideas that are talking about the vaccine, maybe how quickly it's made, whether or not one should take it. And the spread of this disinformation and the way that it travels through different communities is often acknowledged. So we've all seen maybe articles in the New York Times. I feel like I wake up every single day to hear about how COVID-19 vaccine disinformation is one of the biggest reasons that we're not vaccinating quickly enough as a country. But at the Disinfo Defense League, we really felt like a lot of these conversations are missing a lot of nuance. When we have this conversation, we can't uncouple it from the importance of thinking through medical inequities in communities of color, the way that fertility and medical access and care is inaccessible for women of color, and the many different compounding things that impact gender, ability, race that need to be brought in when we're talking about vaccine disinformation. And so today, we will be kicking this off with an incredible panel that I'm really excited to introduce. I want to acknowledge that today, as we talk about the pandemic and we talk about the COVID vaccine disinformation, that we are really thinking about the United States and how it's rolling out, the vaccines are rolling out here. There's obviously a lot of different countries. I know a lot of my community in India is struggling a lot right now. But it's important that we think through and approach all of these issues as a collective, because if there's anything that we've learned in the pandemic, it's how interconnected we are. And so let's kick it off with some intros. I would like to invite our panelists to introduce themselves. And I'm actually going to kick it off with Noor Mir from Women's March, the Digital Advocacy Advisor. There we go. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. My name is Noor. I run the digital advocacy and specifically the digital defense programs at the Women's March aimed at inoculation on specific issues, including COVID, but also immigration, racial justice, reproductive rights, and more. I have been in this role for about a year and a half and have been involved with the Women's March for many years, since the first march, actually. Delighted to be here, and just, as some context, our focus and what I'll be speaking about specifically is around the the impacts of vaccine hesitancy on women writ large, but also the role that white women, specifically women in the wellness community, and also women in suburban areas in the U.S., the role that they can play in combating some of this disinformation and building up vaccine trust in their own communities. So glad to be here and excited to learn with all of you.
Thank you so much, Noor. Can we have a minute for your background? I'm like, wow, that looks amazing. Yes, super excited to have you here. Next up, I want to bring over Ife Ike. Ifeoma Ife Ike.
Hi, yes, good afternoon. So happy to be here. Uh, Ifoma, Ike, Ifeoma Ike, or Iffy, as I uh, ask people to call me so that they don't mess it up. She, her pronouns. And I am the founder and CEO of a space called Pink Cornrows. We are a data informed, people centered equity and social impact firm ranging in support from equity assessments to communication support, advising in several spaces, including research and philanthropy. But we also work very closely with movement and organizers to ensure that the work that's being done on the ground honors those that have been investing in those spaces, and that it's not just extractive or being used or taken into other spaces for more commercial benefit. Um, Specific to this space, we are also a team of lawyers and educators and communicators, and that's really important in this space because it's our we feel very much connected to the history of communities that have unfortunately had to endure hurdles and barriers. And one of the ways that we wanted to support in sharing information was actually just through our lived experiences of being denied care during the pandemic, at which we launched an effort called COVID While Black, which we are happy to talk more about in this conversation. But we want to make sure that however we talk about the ways that we engage with communities and also support communities and dispel narratives, that it's also rooted in the history of why there's such high mistrust, and also that that mistrust is ongoing, and that there are people even today going to the doctor and having the not the greatest experience. Unfortunately, that has racial and gender implications. So we're really excited to be on this panel, and hopefully we can support other people's efforts as they're engaging with our community and communities of color.
Yes, we're so excited to have you here, Iffy. When I first saw your title as Equity Weaver, I was just like, that's how you know you're making magic. So really excited to learn from you and hear more about your work at Pink Cornrows. Next up, we have Jacqueline Mason. There we go.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me, Megna, and nice to see you, everyone else. My name is Jacqueline Mason, and I am Senior Investigative Researcher and Special Projects Manager at First Draft. First Draft is a global nonprofit which combats mis and disinformation. We work with CBOs, we work with DDL, we also work with journalists, and we train people for best practices in mis and disinformation. So my team and I, for the past year, have been looking at political mis and disinformation and how that harms Black and Latinx communities. But after the election, we really moved into COVID-19 vaccine mis and disinformation and what that does within our communities. And we both monitor what conversations are online. We like to think of pre-bunking versus debunking, because if we kind of talk out something before it really hits that tipping point, then we can really have effect on a lot of communities. And we also train the trainer for best practices. So very happy to be here and discuss COVID vaccine misinformation and what we can do about this problem.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline, and thank you for your hard work. I can only imagine what it's like to be in the trenches of the internet. So much gratitude. And finally, we have the one and only Vanessa Gonzalez from the Leadership Conference. There we are. Welcome.
Hey there, everybody. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be on this panel with this amazing group of women. Thank you so much for having myself as well as the Leadership Conference here. Just for folks' awareness, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights is one of the nation's oldest civil rights organizations. We have awesome membership of over 200 civil rights organizations at the national level, and we partner with hundreds of thousands at the state level. I'm going to be talking a little bit about how we need to change the narrative and how we need to be able to start using language that really empowers our communities to speak about why they may take a pause, some caution that they have in engaging with the medical community. It is there's a reason why. And so to talk about that as well, to talk about how we can be good messengers in terms of our health, where good and valid resources are. And then also the leadership conference helped lead some of the fight against dis and misinformation during the census campaign. And there is some overlap when it comes to some of those actors between political dis and misinformation and what we're seeing now. And so really think it's important that we start highlighting those pieces to make sure that we tackle them. So thank you so much for having us.
Yes, Vanessa, thank you. This narrative is exactly what this conversation is about. And I think let's go ahead and dive into it because I'm very excited to get to all these different topics. And I actually want to kick off with a question for you, Jacqueline, as our lead researcher and one of the lead researchers of the Disinfo Defense League. Can you help us kind of get all on the same page or do a little bit of level setting about what is the situation with COVID disinformation? What's the magnitude of what we're seeing, how it's spreading, and kind of share a little bit about what you're seeing on your side?
Great, I'd love to. So as we know, Black communities are disproportionately affected by COVID-19, right? 2 times more likely to die than other communities, especially Black women. We also are affected by police violence and voter suppression, right? And online, Black people are the subject of these same narratives. So topics with false and misleading posts are proliferating across social media at a rapid rate, right? This is something that the platforms had said that they would maybe mitigate. However, due to some gray area, new pages and new posts which talk about vaccine hesitancy and vaccine mis and disinformation continue to proliferate at an alarming rate, right? And we're seeing everything from, let's differentiate the difference between mis and disinformation, right? Some things are meant, misinformation, to be spread not to harm, but to help, right? Fake cures, right? Things that might say, take this sort of solution, MMS, right? Which is a miracle water which prevents COVID, but it does not. It's actually a toxin and a poison. But this could be spread unknowingly in order to save a life because they don't have access to proper vaccines. Where there is disinformation, right, which is really spread and meant to do harm, right? So we see things like that. And why do people spread disinformation? It could be for political gain, as it seems unpopular with wavering administrations, whether it's good to take a COVID vaccine or bad. It could be to profit. We had some people profiting off the idea of past harms, which have been done to Black communities. There was something that was spreading called Not Another Tuskegee. This was attached to a lot of merchandise that was being sold online. Luckily, larger pages like this have been taken down, but many pages still remain, right? Another part is a data deficit, right? So Black and Latinx communities, from what we can see, are either receiving a disproportionate amount of mis and disinformation or a lack of healthy information from the CDC, from the WHO, from a study that was done by the Markup. Fewer posts and ads which promote healthy vaccine information are reaching Black and Latinx people, right? So we're seeing either a data deficit with no information and then unhealthy information. And this is a really large and pervasive problem that we are facing, right? I do think that some of the news about the J&J vaccine really did do some harm. Anytime we kind of get negative news coming into our feeds, we start to doubt vaccine, and that increases our vaccine hesitancy, especially when bad actors start to juxtapose themselves within these places and spread messages of vaccine hesitancy. So after the J&J vaccine, we really saw things that talked about testing on people of color, right? We saw that these vaccines were infected with things. We've seen of the recent, people who are vaccinated could actually harm people who are not vaccinated. And those claims really reignited after we saw a pause in vaccine distribution, right? And just really looking at, we still don't know, we still don't have the numbers on vaccine hesitancy and I'm equity. And I'm really sure that, we'll touch on that further, but that we don't know, how many in our communities have been vaccinated at this point. And this is a really big problem. And as we start to plateau at a very high rate, we're plateauing at 5,000 cases a day. It's not good, especially because of the way, we are affected as women, especially most likely to die of COVID-19. It's a very serious problem. So that disinformation is really causing a wedge that, needs to be stopped.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. I love the way that you're framing or calling it like unhealthy information. I think that reminds me of like smoking a cigarette or like, I don't know, something that's like classified as unhealthy because it really does harm our health. And I think that's an important thing we're trying to uplift here and think through is how does information have these real life impacts? And so I'm hearing you talk about kind of unhealthy information. There's a data deficit, and all of these are also all underscored by vaccine equity. I actually want to pass it over to you, Vanessa, because I know that you were talking a little bit about your goals around directing towards good information more than driving actions and decisions. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we know is that people are always going to be trying to launch campaigns that hold Black and brown people down. Like that is nothing new. That is in our history, and that's in every piece and area of the work. What we have seen through, I'm just going to mention a little bit about Census Campaign. What we saw during Census Campaign is, we started this work on the premises that white supremacists would use disinformation to propagate fear and suppress the participation of Black and brown communities in census. So like that in itself should sound pretty familiar to what we're seeing now. The idea then was to minimize our political and economic power. And the leadership conference, our goal was to limit the amplification of these threats, right? And to do that, we had to be very clear that social media plays a giant and oversized role in this. Obviously, being in lockdown, everybody is on social media almost constantly, I think, myself unfortunately included. And so we had to work very closely with Facebook and with some of the propagators of these platforms to say, hey, you got to put some rules in place. This stuff is incorrect. And so what we're trying to convince folks and talk to folks about is, our communities, Black and brown communities, because there is a absolute right to be hesitant to engage with the medical community at any level because of extreme racist policies and practices, which, as many of you know, not only the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, right, but operating on Black women without anesthesia, the forced sterilization of Black and brown women. And this was not that long ago, right? And even recently, we heard about the stories where folks were saying, Black women and Black skin doesn't feel the same amount of pain, right? And so we're asking people from our communities to then go and take a vaccine, which no one knows a whole lot about, where we're hearing a lot of false information online that is driven through fear. Some of it is not intentional, right? And a big piece of misinformation and disinformation is the intent there. But within our own communities, right? Because all we can see right now is some of our friends and families, that just perpetuates the cycle of mis and disinformation, right? And so we keep on sharing and sharing and sharing. And so what we are doing is we are trying to lift up our work with the Made to Save campaign, which is specifically a campaign that is designed to provide reliable and valid information to everyone across the board when it comes to these vaccines. From our perspective, we're never going to tell somebody you must take a vaccine or this vaccine is better than this vaccine. That's not what our job is. Our job is really to make sure that people have enough of the information from a valid resource so that they can make their own personal decisions, because we very much believe in personal autonomy, particularly when it comes to your body. And what that can look like, and just being really mindful that when you are looking at resources, to think about who is posting this and what do they have to gain from it. Right. And so it's being able to take a little bit of a step back and making sure that those resources, again, are valid. Because we are asking people to engage with the medical community, we understand that you may look at some of those websites and be like, I'm not going to pay attention to CDC, HHS, you name it. Right. And so, the leadership conference is a place that we're sharing information. Made to Save is where we're sharing information. And these are long established organizations who have worked within communities, our own communities, for generations now.
Wow. There are so many different things I want to parse out there, Vanessa, and thank you for that really rich overview. I think just like the frame that you use, that like we all do have personal autonomy of our bodies, is something that is a really important value to hold and way to approach this work, right? And where the harm of the medical industry, and to your point, history, but also very recent history, current and future, of medical inequities comes in, where we're lacking giving people personal autonomy of their body. So I want to, one, just uplift that. And I also want to dive in a little deeper and ask some of the other panel members. Vanessa, you spoke about the way that different content comes across around healthcare and how you've worked previously with the election and census around some of these content pieces with platforms. I want to open this question to the rest of the panel around how does healthcare access play a role in the way that we moderate and think about medical misinformation on the internet?
Yeah, I'm happy to at least help start the conversation around even just grounding us in the fact that access is not real for many communities, right? The term access even implies that we all have it. It implies that it's accessible. It implies that it is of high quality. And it also implies that while you're there, it's a great experience. Just as recently as this past October, over 70% of African Americans in this one particular research poll, and I apologize for the background noise, had stated that they were discriminated against or they were treated unfairly. Over 50% of those stated that they had a distrust period of the medical field. And so it's really important in this conversation that we do acknowledge that in some ways words that we have used matter. They've always mattered within our community. And even as we, and some of us have had this conversation around, even as we use the word hesitancy or even the word mistrust, it puts the blame on the communities to exhibit some type of relationship that never existed, that was never real, and honestly was really harmful, and never corrected itself to correct course before this pandemic. Now this information is coming to our communities, right, where we have to account for the fact that there are many states that have conservative leadership that has not expanded Medicare, Medicaid, like the basic forms of healthcare that would allow for community members to at least have accessible resources before the pandemic. We have not seen a major disruption within the medical institutions themselves, especially in light of this movement for Black lives. While we have seen spaces like White Coats for Black lives, we haven't seen an actual shift until recently with statements, and we'll see how far those statements go, whether from the American Medical Association or some of the larger associations that they themselves have rooted in in the harm towards enslaved bodies. And I also think that it's really important as we talk about equity, which still really hasn't happened in depth as far as a practice, although I think the conversation is starting to happen, in recognizing that even in the terms when we are trying to center communities of color, terms like communities of color, like BIPOC, like people of color, can erase the ways that the histories are both valuable as models of oppression, but also unique, right? And also recognizing that the genocide of Indigenous people has a lot to do with the statistics around what Indigenous communities are experiencing and were experiencing during this pandemic, but also the history of enslaved Africans informs other communities as well, right? So we've never really stopped to really think about how our entire field of OBGYN comes from the disruption and the manipulation and the assault of Black women's bodies, and why today we still have research that shows that students that are practicing to be our practitioners still believe that we have different type of skin, thicker skin, and that's recently. So I do think that when we are talking about medical access, we also have to recognize that it's never really been fully accessible, that we take a risk every time we go to the doctor, that even if you are an individual that has means, that has nothing to do with what your relationship is with an institution that is outside of yourself. And that is the overwhelming majority of us, right? And so it would be great during this pandemic if we see this as an opportunity to correct the course for the long haul, not just for this time period. But I do think that, Magna, as you raised that question around access, we need to start with some really hard truths that, you know, healthcare wasn't accessible before the pandemic, intentionally wasn't accessible by design. And so it is therefore in many ways dishonest for us to then believe that we should focus on the behavior of individuals that have been harmed instead of the institutions that were designed to cause harm, right? And the minute we kind of ground that, I hope that we can move away from words like hesitancy and mistrust and actually start looking at medical apartheid and in some ways medical harm as the way that we talk about the starting point of why people are not being vaccinated, and then move towards what does it mean for the institution to address its harm as a route and a pathway to meet people with their medical needs.
I'm like, yes, that was so rich. And there's so many different things I want to dive into there. And I'm so grateful to you for bringing up so much of this nuance. I think that this idea of centering around behavior is a lot of what we're seeing as an issue with the way people are talking about COVID vaccine disinformation. And to your point, like, yes, why are we saying vaccine hesitancy? And really thinking about the onus that we're placing. And I think the way that we're shaping this conversation and the way that so many of you all are moving is really trying to think through what the long haul can look like. And I kind of actually want to ask a follow-up question to you around this behavior piece. So one of the audience members who registered for this event asked a really great question in their registration. And they said, you know, a lot of white communities already have an abundance of access to resources where the spread of COVID doesn't have as much of an impact on them. How do we build that collective caretaking within our communities, or what is the work that we can do within our communities?
Yeah, I would love to hear from others, but very quickly, I know that one of the things that we would love for us to advocate for is recognizing the healers and the community-based practitioners that have been filling the gap for such a long time, and finally advocating for them to be included in our quote unquote traditional or standardized healthcare. Part of that is because one of a major barrier for the way some cities are designed is purely just accessibility, and that can be transportation, but also time with work, and trust is still a big thing there. So I do think that that's one part of how we think long-term, right? It's not an immediate fix, but it does require some intentional organizing around how do we actually look at the design of communities differently and talk about what basic human rights are and what that means as far as what should be in people's proximities. The second part, very quickly, I do think is we do have to have a little bit of a truth and reconciliation as part of the process towards actually healing, which is something we don't talk, even though we're talking about medicine, we don't talk quite a bit about healing, but what does it mean as for healing to be the starting point? And healing starts with truth, acknowledging that there are these issues, and then really moving towards the models, whether it's in the continent or in other spaces outside of the United States, where we have seen truth and reconciliation. And I don't even want to say reconciliation because you can't reconcile what wasn't together, but truth, truth and actual, like, you know, transformation. What does it look like for those spaces to actually happen when it comes to medicine throughout society, especially if we're talking about femme folk, birthing folk, what that means when we are still in a pandemic and people have other needs that have also been compromised that we're not even talking as much about. Much hasn't changed for our bodies and our interaction with those systems. So I'll stop there, but I think that we can start with some advocacy around increasing community access, but also making sure that we don't run away from like how history has to have an accountability, and practitioners need to have recommitments to our communities. The work is on them, not on the communities.
Yeah, to jump in here, I 100% agree with that. I used to be a practicing social worker for a few years in Arizona, and we were always considered another just out there. We were never fully embraced by the medical community to be seen as possible outreach experts, right? And we were going into homes and into communities that a lot of medical professionals would never go into, right? But we happily went in to help folks and help their children and help families and provide them resources that I think a lot of us, myself included, may take for granted is easily accessible via the internet, right? I can just jump on, I can get in my car, I can get in these places, and that is just not a reality for so many people, particularly those most at risk and hardest hit by COVID. And I think it is part about you know, as we talked a little bit about that intersectional planning, right? What does it look like to have transportation in those locations to good medical facilities that actually, you know, have translators that take into account the needs of our trans community brothers and sisters, right? All of these types of different facets. What can that look like? You know, from Leadership Conference and from my own personal, we need to continue to vote and to exercise that vote at the local level. We don't just have elections every 4 years, and they're constant, and someone is always campaigning. And what we have actually seen is because we were so successful at turnout this last cycle, and we had Black and Brown folks and youth in particular turn out in droves and in record numbers in some of our states, we see a record number of state legislators dropping anti-voting bills. And so that is in direct correlation to that. And so there is a fear that we are finally speaking out and we're tired of this, and we are going to push to rectify what a white supremacist system built intentionally to leave us out of. And so I think, you know, for me, and I know that there is always hesitancy to think about, I'm going to engage with voting and voting doesn't matter. All of those things we proved are not true this last cycle. So while I can understand that there might still be some fear or some concerns around really the impact of that, it really does matter. And so if we're looking at, you know, the school boards, if we're looking at our medical boards, all of those things matter. I also fully realize that even engagement in some of these spaces, right, they are intentionally making it harder for us to vote, to elect our local elected officials who help with these planning of communities, who help decide bus routes, who help to decide where community clinics will sit. They're making it harder for us to be able to have our voices heard. And so we have to double down efforts. And I know it's exhausting, and continue to say no. And so I also implore, while we're making the push to widen the circle and we start looking at things from an intersectional lens, right? And we start advocating that people also come to our communities, come to our apartments, our housing facilities, you name it, that we also continue to push back against a broken system to create a new one.
Yes. Okay. This is giving me so much life. One, I think, like, thank you, Vanessa, for acknowledging just the way, and I think if you also spoke to this, of the way that this entire white supremacist system is really intentionally built in this way. Nothing is on accident. And also the importance of leveraging this moment for real transformation. And also, as you mentioned, Vanessa, it is exhausting. It does get tiring, but this is also a pivotal moment for us to move forward. One, really quickly, I want to shout out to the audience. So in probably like 10-15 minutes, we'll be opening it up for audience questions. So if you want to, if any of the speakers are speaking to you, get in the chat, go ahead and kind of share your thoughts, give them some love. And also, if you have any questions on anything anyone's sharing, you can go ahead and put them there, and we'll be opening it up shortly. I do want to kind of switch gears, but not too much, and talk to you, Noor. I know that when you're doing amazing work at Women's March and really thinking about this in pretty nuanced and interesting ways, I would love to hear what your thoughts are on what everyone's sharing, and also about the way that you're approaching your work to deal with a lot of these issues.
Absolutely. I mean, firstly, I want to echo this need for specificity. I think sometimes on, both progressive and left movements, we fall into a pattern of conflating identities because it's easy, when the specificity and acknowledgement of unique experiences could actually really lend to how we do this work. So from a personal perspective, I grew up in Pakistan where polio has ravaged communities, and the majority of healthcare workers and vaccine workers are women that are murdered in the streets doing their jobs. So what does that do? Both in terms of the diaspora, but also first and second generation immigrant trauma, in remembering these stories that aren't really that far back in history. So what you said, with regards to the specificity really spoke to me, because I feel as though those narratives and stories are embedded in how we think about medicine and how we think about medical trauma, and is resurfacing in a real way in our communities now. So just want to really acknowledge and re-up that. Secondly, I mean, something that I'm thinking through with regards to women in particular, and there was a really good article in the New York Times earlier this week, I think over the weekend, called "What Do Women Want?" For men to get vaccinated. And we know that women are getting vaccinated at a far higher rate, about 10 percentage points in the US right now, even though COVID-19 deaths worldwide have been about 2.4 times higher for men than for women. And what does that mean in terms of the disproportionate burden that women already carry when it comes to caring for others, not only in the US, but in the world? And how does that impact their decision and their motivation, and also the decisions that they don't really have a choice but to make in their families and in their communities? And this article covered a few different different reasons or streams of exploration I wanted to bring to this conversation. Number one, that women do account for 3/4 of full-time healthcare workers, 75% of public school teachers. They lost the majority of the earliest jobs in retail, in healthcare and government jobs, and they're also women do have to make the decision to figure out how to manage a shift to remote schooling or homeschooling for their kids during this, and also caring for partners and their sick relatives. So how does that impact this gap that we're witnessing? And also, how does that lead into the work that we do need to do to continue to motivate women and work within communities? So two things that I was thinking about, in the conversation around, what is the content we're seeing? Where do we meet people where they're at? For me, my roots are in organizing, that is picking up the phone and calling people, door knocking, coming up with block to block plans. So how are women organized right now? How are they receiving information? How are they communicating to each other? For me, and I'm sure other immigrants with different chat experiences or group experiences could speak to this, I'm seeing disinformation and misinformation around the vaccine in multiple languages, in my native language, in places like WhatsApp. I'm not seeing it scrolling through Facebook necessarily, right? So how can we have that type of granular view and be able to right size our strategy to meet that? Are we talking about book clubs? Are we talking about, mommy lifestyle blogs? Are we talking about Christian evangelical women in their own Facebook groups? What role do they play as Facebook moderators for those groups? What's happening on Nextdoor? So for me, that's what we're trying to parse through right now, is where are those conversations happening, and how can we pinpoint the types of values and storytelling that meets women where they're at, knowing that they are having to carry these decisions and could use some support in navigating this within their own communities.
Yes. Okay. There's a few different follow-up questions I want to ask you, but before we go there, I want to emphasize your point around identity. And I think if you brought this up first, of the way that we even use the term BIPOC, it's so broad, and it really doesn't allow us to actually address any issue because we're just so focused on being at this very high level, and calling every solution a solution for communities of color. There were quite a few folks who actually put in questions around language. So Spanish language disinformation, Vietnamese disinformation. I'm curious, Jacqueline, on the research end, what you've been seeing in terms of different languages and the way that things spread in different languages compared to English.
Great. So currently at First Draft, we are monitoring things just in Spanish language. In the past, in First Draft, we have monitored over 15 different languages, right? And really what we do in like our system is really using keywords and like how those keywords kind of move throughout the kind of like the social ecosphere, right? So, you know, for English, we obviously start with vaccines. Obviously, we move that into Spanish language, and then we can kind of see posts that are more popular that start to use other kinds of keywords and other kinds of indicators to say how they're feeling positively or negatively about these vaccines, right? And it's a range of things. I mean, as far as COVID-19, unfortunately, I think I brought it up earlier, but there is the MMS, Miracle Water Solution. It has killed many people in South America. This is a really big problem that it's still being sold, and it was still being sold on Amazon up until recently, right? And it's caused death. Right. And we also have newscasters talking about MMS and how that flows. When the pausing of the vaccines did take place, you know, we saw a lot of J&J juxtaposed with asbestos, right? Because of the lawsuit that took place a few years ago, right? So we're comparing now that to MMS and to, you know, any sort of toxins, right? And so now there's narratives of toxins in vaccines, right? So a lot of that stuff flows from English language to Spanish, right? So really for us, it really is about keeping an ear to the ground and seeing what these conversations are online, trying to identify who's having them. There are big blind spots. In particular, that is WhatsApp. So many conversations are flowing on private WhatsApp groups, and we are not able to monitor those conversations, right? And those can potentially do a lot of harm. And we know because we have seen snippets of WhatsApp groups and what kind of information flows within those groups. So really trying to monitor like closed spaces is very difficult, but you know, joining closed groups and kind of looking at the dialogue that's going in within there is a pretty interesting way and how we monitor different languages at First Draft.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. Yeah, I think just to emphasize again and underscore this point that if we're not handling this issue in English, the situation in many different languages is one, difficult to even understand the scope of and monitor, especially on these different platforms, but two, even harder to address. So it's important that we're continuing to bring this into the conversation. We have a bunch of really great audience questions I want to pass to, but really quickly before then, Noor, I actually wanted to come back to you and the work that you're leading. And you've talked to me about a pretty interesting dilemma that you've been facing with the community you've been organizing with Women's March around folks who do believe or who are maybe identify as anti-vax. And I was wondering if you'd be open to sharing with us some of the challenges you're having with organizing around disinformation.
Absolutely. I mean, one big piece of it, and I'm sure that others may have come across this as well, is the you know, the fact that it is a lot more widespread than one would assume, and that it's hard to think about targeting from an organizing or campaigning standpoint moms writ large, right? And we're talking about moms all over the country that, you know, whether it's intentional or not, may be following influencers that are perpetuating some really dangerous anti-vaxxer sentiment. I mean, something that that has been covered that I would just want to lift up, for instance, around January 6th. There was Dr. Christine Northrup, who is one of the, you know, the primary anti-vaxxer influencers out on the internet. She actually did a 6-day water fast that was timed with the beginning of the insurrection in DC on January 6th, and tied it explicitly to QAnon and to QAnon ideals, talking about about natural immunity, talking about God's nutrients. So we're seeing this this linking and interconnectedness between overtly white supremacist ideals that are whose flames are further stoked in these far right cults, actually seep into some of these mom centric lifestyle blogs. So it is hard to think through how to approach an issue like that, especially when it's around mothering or caretaking, and something that we experiment with, and we will continue to experiment with, is what we can do by reaching out to our own network of influencers that are mothers, that do have some aspect of wellness, even if it's not overtly new age spirituality or ideology in their work. How can we use them as middle women, as communicators, as linkers, to be able to proactively push back on this? So it's definitely a challenge, but we have to do it. And I know that you started off by talking about this work as about collective interest, and that's the framework that we are going to continue to use despite some of the hardships and obstacles of maneuvering this work.
Okay, this is a perfect segue. If you know me, I love segues into our first audience question. So thank you for that, Noor and the Tia. This audience member asked, there are a lot of people who witness the failures of the government in responding to the crisis. How do we talk to people who experience all the ways that government falls short and are being asked to trust the government on this?
Yeah, I don't. I wonder, like, that is 100% fair, and that is absolutely right. And we have eons of history to say the government has failed us. And for many folks, our communities are resilient, in spite of government and other structures' attempts to pull us down, right? And so it is hard. It's a hard question. I think what we also have to be able to do is to look at some of the wins. And I know sometimes that's really hard. I am a believer in that government can do the most harm and the most good for the most amount of people the quickest. And we have seen that in whether you're talking about war, whether you're talking about healthcare, whether you're talking about poverty. And so as you look at all these intersectional issues, there are also advocates who are fighting very, very hard and have been to make sure and to push government and to hold people accountable. After, he who shall never be named was kicked out because of our collective work and our collective votes. A lot of people, I think, particularly in more privileged spaces, felt like the sun was going to come up and the world and the country was just going to be better. And I think many of us rooted in more of a reality and more of a historical reality knew that that was not going to be the case. And so we continue to have conversations and hold people accountable, right? This administration, while better, is not perfect. And there are definitely some blind spots that we need to have addressed. And we are continuing to push them and hold them to account for some of the promises made and to address some of the issues that we have long begged to be fixed. I think what I put my faith in, just speaking for me and myself, is the organizers and the people who are pushing to hold all electeds and government accountable and who are actually building alongside government these side structures, which is also why it's so important to continue to include folks who don't necessarily fit into the, in this case, particularly the medical community, right? And who are not necessarily defined by the medical community, right? The midwives, the curanderas for some, right? People who we find comfort in and who we feel like we can get an honest response from. And so, again, that's where I can find the comfort and some of the security in knowing that there are people out there fighting for this and that there are some of those side structures being built. It is by no means adequate. It is by no means what we should be having, but it is also, I think, realistically where we are.
If I can add very quickly, I've actually seen some doctors and doctors of color supporting white doctors in this really, really simple, but I do think it's an opportunity as far as a messaging. We need people to just acknowledge people's truth. I know that seems just like a very hard thing to do, or something that may seem very simple. I don't know. But the reality is, within the medical community, or within the people are not coming in as much as I actually appreciate that there was an article that was shared by quite a few feminists, Black feminists, that were saying that it's actually not just Tuskegee, right? That's actually not what was the conversation in Black communities. It wasn't that. The assumption was made from a lot outside of our community that that would be the dominant narrative that was happening within our community, and it wasn't that, right? And I say this saying that, like, one of the most impactful, insightful spaces that I was privileged to be in was a distrust conversation within a Navajo Nation space, where they actually began the conversation. The medical doctor that was there, she began the conversation with the oppression and the truth of what has happened with white communities and colonization on their land, and then proceeded to go forward and said, this is not about forcing you to take vaccination. Let's focus on the joy on the other side. And it was really about how communities who also had been harmed and hurting and been away from their community members, could you see this not as the answer or the anecdote, or that it's even going to erase history, but to really focus on how to reunite and build even stronger alliances to keep fighting. Right. And so I do think that if we're going to honor the histories that people have gone through, recognize that history implies that it's in the past, and it's not in the past, right? We actually have to meet people in the present, but also really using truth and really saying to doctors, educate yourself on starting first, not on trying to explain, but to say, I hear you, and what you have gone through is valid, and my industry is racist. And then moving forward as to how can I serve you better? And if there's any way that I am adding to that discomfort, please let me know. And I know that that's something that feels like, oh, okay, well, we can do it. Then we need to do it. Because what communities, and I will speak as a Black woman who also has had my experiences, unfortunate experiences here in New York City, what is so frustrating is when people try to explain to you what is not just a 1 or 2 time experience. This, for many people, is a lifelong experience. They know their truth. And I think we need a little bit more of telling people, but also in mass, like the outlets and the platforms that we have, that the communities are not wrong. And it is on us to tell them and keep letting them know that we have to earn your trust. And I do think that that turns the power dynamic a little bit differently, where people are going to have to work on both the interpersonal and the mass communication within our communities. But I would really love, I've actually been waiting to see what it would look like for the mass conversation to not be about how do we restore as much as how do we establish as we are trying to administer and save lives. So I would say that I would love to see more of that conversation.
Oh my gosh, the gems, the fire. I hope the chat's blowing up right now. That's amazing. And I think, Ify, this way that you're talking about acknowledging people's truth really hits hard on what's missing from a lot of these conversations, right? People maybe are trying to honor histories in a very assumption-based way, or talking about Tuskegee, not really thinking through the present. I want to open it up to the next audience question before we do our closing remarks. Often misinformation and disinformation about the campaigns come from other countries. How do we navigate sharing good information when people are receiving misinformation from people that they trust and people from abroad?
I'm happy to take a stab at this one. I definitely, as we were on this, I actually received an interesting graphic with a unproven and wrong remedy in a WhatsApp group, and literally just right now. And I was just thinking through what I am going to say back to people that I dearly love. We're talking grandmothers and aunties who want nothing but to see us feel better and be better and to be with us again. So my tried and true model, what we do at the Women's March in our process with our digital defense work is never a outright persuasion, an outright debunking and combating. We have a 3-step sort of recipe that we use, and we always start with an affirmation. That affirmation could look like saying somebody's name. That affirmation could be saying, hey, this is how I know you. Hey, Magna, I've known you for a while and I really, really respect you. So I feel like I have to tell you that, there's something about this that you should know. Another way to think about this is XYZ, or, hey, have you seen if anybody else has shared this? I ran a search on it, and it was something that hasn't been proven. I just wanted to let you know, so that you can do your own research. I know this is a simplistic approach, but you really can take this approach to pretty much anything. So that's how I'm going to structure my response, right? Is like affirm the other person's dignity and humanity, and also talk about the fact that there is an overwhelming amount of information. If I'm sure that a lot of you, like me, have been handholding relatives and families as they're trying to navigate emails and websites and phone calls when English isn't even their first language, when getting to the phone itself is a journey. So that affirmation and that simplicity, I think, is key in how you structure your response and meet them where they're at, but never with condescension. I don't think it works.
Yeah, I also think it's really important to remember, right, the difference between mis and disinformation in these points. These people are not disinformation networked agents, right, trying to harm you. They're your friends, they're your family. They're actually spreading these things because COVID is killing people and they are trying to help, right? And they're not helping. But I completely agree, Nor, that the best way really is to talk to them one-on-one. I would recommend definitely leaving whatever group chat, if you can contact them, on their personal number or one-on-one and DM, and really have that conversation as a human, because we're all in this fight together. It's not meant to, no one's trying to kill anyone, but by spreading this misinformation, we can, right? So let's all keep our humanity in check and really realize we're all out here fighting that same fight and to help each other.
Yes. Thank you all. And I think just this theme that keeps coming up, and I think something I really admire about the way that all of you all are approaching your work is just the idea of dignity, which sounds so base level, but it's missing in so many of these conversations, is giving people their autonomy, giving people their dignity, affirming that this is hard, this is complicated, this is not going to be solved by one meme, right? It's a whole conversation, it's a whole integration of really changing the way that we care for one another. And this is really an opportunity to transform our care for one another. I know we're unfortunately running up on time, and I wish, there's full conversations to be had on so many different points that you all brought up, but I would like to pass it over to you all for some closing remarks. I would love if you could share any of your reflections or things that came up for you during this conversation, as well as one way that the audience can help support some of your work right now.
I feel like I've been talking a lot, so I wanted to to let someone else come in. So, for me, I think what is really important is that we continue to hold the power, right? We need to control our narrative, and stop saying that communities are hesitant. We are cautious, right? And rightfully so. The term hesitancy and that frame rather than confidence, it's not only offensive, but it implies a deficit. It ignores our documented dark history of medical apartheid. It puts it back on the community, right? So we are cautious, and you need to show us why we should not be cautious. Why should we trust what you are asking us to do? And so I think when we think about how is one way that we can feel power in some of these conversations, and we can feel that we have the power to make our own decisions, is to start viewing community conversations and community narratives through that more powerful frame, and don't allow others to define our very legitimate concerns. I think when when we go out and we're talking about disinformation, misinformation, absolutely right. Our people are not trying to kill us. There may be really bad actors out there who that is their goal. And so they are the disinformation pushing that out, right? And they're making sure that they know how to hit us in our softer spots. And so we have to be really secure in where we're going for information and where we're looking for information to combat some of this negative stuff and stuff that we hear is incorrect, because misinformation is to beliefs are directly connected to beliefs that are rooted in truth, right? So racism in the healthcare system makes the misinformation more powerful because that part is true, and it is a tactic that they will use. So again, I think for right now, for all of us, one of the best things that we can do is just go to really reliable resources and making sure that we are using the tips that were described about how to really have that one-on-one personal conversation that's rooted in truth and rooted in reliable and verifiable information, just as folks are telling us some stuff that really we know is not true. And so Made to Save campaign has some good stuff that you could visit their website. And of course, always the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights is also a great point of information. So please, you can sign up on our emails. Thanks.
Thank you, Vanessa.
I'm happy to go ahead.
Okay, so I would just quickly say two things. One thing that we like to practice at First Draft is something we call emotional skepticism, right? If something makes you happy, sad, want to buy something, very angry, it usually is a sign to really stop and think before you share, right? Because that kind of information can sometimes hold mis or disinformation, right? So when we're talking to our loved ones, we're talking to people that we know about misinformation in particular and the spread of that. So thinking before we share is a really, really important and critical thing we can do. Another thing I'd really like to highlight is that, failure to understand communities of color will result in critical misunderstanding of the impact of misinformation. Much like Ify said, something like Tuskegee was not something that Black communities were talking about at the beginning of the dawn of coronavirus vaccines, right? We then saw that later. There was hesitancy, but that hesitancy eventually waned, right? There were other concerns. There were concerns about, actual impacts of healthcare professionals on their day-to-day, but newsrooms did go with this kind of Tuskegee narrative, and that really proliferated at a much higher rate than the actual reasons that Black individuals might not want to take a COVID vaccine. So I think that, as people who are reading misinformation, if you're taking in things from the media, it's important to think about kind of these overarching narratives and try to find some actual critical work that talks about, kind of these narratives. And if you go on firstdraft.org, we do have a misinformation course. It's 14 days. It's called Protection from Deception. You get a little text every day. It's actually quite fun. There's videos included. There's little quizzes included, and kind of builds up your tolerance to mis and disinformation in order to not be as susceptible. So I do suggest everyone take that. And thank you very much.
I will be quick, but just want to lift up this idea of how to be affirmative in your reframe. What is it that causes anti-vaxxer sentiment amongst mothers? Is it that they want to see their children safe? Is it because this information is overwhelming? Is it because they have had their own experiences with healthcare or childcare or harm towards their families that factors into this? So how can we paint a world where they are listened to, where their children are healthy, where they do feel like they have all the information to make the right decision, and meet them with that content, with their format? I think that just something that we're trying to do is, it doesn't all need to be a public ad. It doesn't all need to be copy that we urge people to share. It should be GIFs. It should be memes. It should be lo-fi videos. It should be blog posts. So as much as we can diversify what we're doing to actually make it usable and accessible for people, from an organizing standpoint, is our best bet at this point. And then in terms of getting involved, we do these trainings every month on different issues. Our next focus will be around how to talk to your friends and family about the vaccine. So you can head to the volunteer hub at womensmarch.com to sign up and get involved.
Okay, we are super over, and I never like when I'm the last person to speak. It is like, what? I mean, what? And obviously, because this is just kind of like, woman of, now I'm saying women of color, right? Women of color magic. It's even more comforting, which is also to say that conversations like this absolutely matter. We all have different perspectives because we're supposed to, and we all have different audiences that we are credible messengers for. So I do think that we need to support people in, and I love what Nora had mentioned, because I am a huge proponent of how we also look at what tools are the most accessible. And in a nation that's at least 40% of functionally illiterate, right? We do have to think about what are the tools that help people still empower their community members, and how empowerment does not become an elitist or a selectivist, if you will, space, right? Of a transactional relationship. So very quickly, first of all, our website is pinkcornrows.com. We are happy to support those that are trying to find ways to weave history, messaging, and effective strategies to ensure that they're reaching their audiences. But I also want to highlight some books for the sustainable conversation. I've already dropped in Medical Apartheid. There's also a book called Killing the Black Body for those that really want to understand the intersectional realities of Black women, which I believe is also applicable to other communities, as well as queer bodies, which oftentimes doesn't get discussed in these spaces. But I do want us to really take a moment to do something called listening. I remember when I was getting my hair done not too long ago, actually in the winter, and I was just at the barbershop, and I heard some information that wasn't quite accurate, but I decided not to intervene. And while the information itself was not accurate, the logic was very sound as to why community members in this particular place, this particular location in Brooklyn, why they had such similar stories of distrust, similar stories of also having underdiagnosis or misinformation from the medical community, and also how that played out in their questions and concerns around feeling like their bodies were going to be testing grounds, right? Really being concerned about why is it that all of a sudden America wants specifically Black and brown communities to be the first ones to take this medicine or these vaccines. Listening, I do think, is something that we have not been afforded, and as has been raised so many times on this panel, trusting that what we're saying is correct. We may not have the full medical background, but the experiences that people are going through are real. And one of the things that we are at least proud of when we launched a project last year called COVID While Black is that we were able to capture some of the narratives from people that some of them are no longer here, or their loved ones are no longer here. And so if we move beyond statistics, or even move beyond the feeling of like we have to meet this national goal of making sure everyone is vaccinated, while that is important, and really take micro conversations as opportunities to be in community, and recognizing that community is the space that trust, that breeds trust, and therefore breeds sharing of information, then I think we can really strategize on how we redesign our kits and redesign how we tell people to influence their loved ones and their communities, versus always trying to prove to people that they're wrong. The final thing is, I do think we need some organized support within the medical community, with providers, simple scripts that allow them to meet people through empathy and not always through intellect, and really sit with how individuals do enter into this space. One question that sometimes is really helpful is, how are you feeling right now? And do you have any discomfort with receiving medical information or medical advice? It may open the door to hearing from that particular patient and their family as to how they're feeling at that moment. So I do think we have to really find ways to be more within community, as Noor and others have mentioned, but also to really support those that have the power, which is the medical field.
Wow. Thank you all so much. I know we're over time, but I don't feel bad because I think everything that was said was so important to hear. And I just want to affirm the many different points that were brought up here of how we're really looking for quick solutions around COVID vaccine disinformation and misinformation. But we need to dive deeper. We need to get specific and think through the different identities that we're working with. We need to listen, which I think this is a skill that a lot of us have forgotten. Thinking through how we're building around emotional skepticism and really taking this moment to build power, to build bodily autonomy and dignity that has been taken away by so many complex systems that are really designed to kill in many ways. And this is an opportunity for transformation. So I want to just extend a huge, huge, huge thank you to you all, not only for this panel and your words and your guidance, but for all of the work that you do on a day-to-day basis. I know it's exhausting, and we are super excited to support you. And a lot of gratitude to our listeners who tuned in and asked questions and stayed engaged. This is just the beginning of a very important conversation, and we're excited to continue it. Thank you all so much.